Hello, my name is Joshua Williamson, and welcome to the Gamer Slays podcast. On today's episode, we will be talking about a very popular video game series known as The Legend of Zelda. The Legend of Zelda series is a series by Nintendo about a boy dressed in green who goes to save princesses. Today, what I'm going to be explaining is the timeline of this series, because it is pretty complicated and hard to understand. So let's just jump right into it. Now, what you need to know about the world of The Legend of Zelda is that it is different from our own. In fact, the creation of this world, which will later be known as Hyrule, is 3 golden goddesses descended from the heavens, and they created the land and the laws of nature and all of the life beings that would live on this land. And they, at the point where they departed back to the heavens after they had created the world, is they left 3 golden triangles, or relics, that became known as the Triforce. And these triangles, they had the power to grant any wish that the user desired. Now, one would think that this would be a good thing, but obviously there are bad people in this world who will try to take advantage of this power, which is in fact what did happen in the first Legend of Zelda game we're going to be talking about, Skyward Sword. Now, in Skyward Sword, basically, there is this goddess Hylia, and she was tasked with defending the Triforce. But unfortunately, this bad demon broke out of the ground. His name is Demise. He came, and he wanted to take the Triforce for himself. Now, the rules of the Triforce are that no immortal being can use the Triforce's power. Only a mortal can wish on the Triforce to have their wish granted. So Hylia, this goddess, she came up with this plan to lower herself to a mortal existence in a form that would later be known as Zelda. And Zelda would, along with the assistance of her chosen hero Link, defeat Demise, this demon, and they would save the realm. And Link eventually did manage to defeat the Demon King. But unfortunately, the Demon King decided to bestow a little bit of a curse upon Link and Zelda, and that curse would be that an incarnation of his hatred would forever follow them and doom the world to repeat a cycle of getting into trouble and trying to defeat evil. Which is how, in the next Zelda game we're going to be talking about, Minish Cap, an incarnation of evil known as Vaati, comes to try to kidnap Zelda, or a descendant of the previous Zelda we were talking about. Something to know about this series is that the Links and the Zeldas, they keep reincarnating over and over again, which is part of the curse of the Demon King. And all that happens in this game is Link and Zelda defeat this demon, and in doing so forge this sword known as the Four Sword, which is a magical sword that has the ability to split Link into 4 separate beings. Which leads to the next game, which is known as Four Sword. In Four Sword, Link uses the Four Sword to defeat a nasty villain, and that's basically all that happens in that game. And up until this point, the timeline has been pretty chronological, one event after the other. This is where things change with our next game, which is known as Ocarina of Time. Now, this game is really important for the timeline split, because this is the game in which the timeline split occurs. Basically, what happens in this game is our Link and Zelda work together to try to defeat a new villain known as Ganondorf. Now, Ganondorf seeks the Triforce for himself. At the moment, the Triforce is hidden away in a safe place known as the Sacred Realm, which is locked behind a magical door in this place known as the Temple of Time. The Temple of Time is the location of a very important sword known as the Master Sword. The Master Sword is the key to opening the door to the Triforce, and it is basically the sword that can defeat any evil at all. Basically, what happens in Ocarina of Time is Zelda encourages Link to find the Master Sword in order to defeat Ganondorf. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is as soon as Link pulls the Master Sword out of its pedestal in the Temple of Time, he gets sealed away for 7 years because he's too young to wield it properly. And this is the bad part, because Ganon sneaks into the Temple of Time, gets into the Sacred Realm, and steals the Triforce and tries to make a wish on it. Fortunately, though, there is a rule with the Triforce where if your heart is not balanced in all the 3 virtues that the Triforce represents, which is power, wisdom, and courage, the Triforce will split into 3, and you only get to keep one of the parts. So Ganondorf got to keep the Triforce of Power, but unfortunately, the Triforce of Power did still give him enough power to conquer the entire kingdom of Hyrule. Link and Zelda eventually managed to defeat him after the 7 years have passed, and Link learns to wield a Master Sword. But what ends up happening is Zelda decides that since Link has sort of lost his childhood, she can send him back in time, and he can relive his lost years. This is a sweet decision on her part, but unfortunately it does have dire consequences for the rest of the timeline, because the timeline ends up splitting into 3 places when she decides to do this. One of the splits is actually just a hypothetical scenario, but the other 2 splits are the most important. These 2 splits are called the child and adult timeline. The child timeline follows Link when he went back in time. What he does when he goes back in time is he warns the kingdom of the impending disaster, and they're able to stop it before it happens. What happens in the adult timeline is Link has gone. They've defeated Ganondorf, but the hero is gone. They don't have anyone to defend them, so eventually Ganondorf creeps back and is able to once again threaten the lands of Hyrule. This leads to the adult timeline's first game, Wind Waker. Wind Waker is a game that follows this Hyrule. What ended up happening is because Ganondorf was so threatening and they didn't have a hero to defend them, the gods decided to flood the world, which gives birth to this land of islands and people living on those islands. And a new Link arises eventually, and when Ganondorf comes to threaten the islands and the new home of the people, Link is able to defeat Ganondorf and save everyone. And this leads us to our next game in the series, which is known as Phantom Hourglass. Phantom Hourglass is a game in which Link and Zelda are threatened by the evil ghost ship while they're searching for a new land that will be known as New Hyrule. And this ghost ship houses a demon known as Malladus. Link and Zelda are eventually able to defeat this demon and find the land that will be known as New Hyrule in the next game in the series, Spirit Tracks. Spirit Tracks is a game in which it takes place 100 years after the events of Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, and in this game, Zelda and Link live in New Hyrule. The kingdom has been rebuilt, and there is train tracks everywhere, and they are able to defeat this demon known as Malladus again, and they save the kingdom. Again! What a surprise. And so this is actually where the adult timeline ends. So I'm going to move on now to the child timeline, which follows Link as he is sent back in time to relive his true childhood after the events of Ocarina of Time. And what happens after this, after warning the kingdom of the impending disaster that is about to occur, Link leaves the land of Hyrule, and he decides to go on a journey to find a friend that he lost along the way. And this leads us to the next game in the series, Majora's Mask. Now, Majora's Mask is a game that follows Link as he is robbed in the woods, and his magical ocarina, known as the Ocarina of Time, is stolen by an imp who lives in the forest. So he follows this imp, and he quite literally falls down a rabbit hole. After falling down this rabbit hole, he finds himself in a parallel world to Hyrule, and this place is known as Termina. Termina is unsettling because it holds a bunch of familiar faces to those he's seen in Hyrule. but they're completely different people. What he finds in this land is that there is this giant moon that is about to crash into the world in 3 days. And if he can't, stop this imp who is being controlled by a magical mask known as Majora's Mask, the entire world will be gone. He does eventually end up finding a way to fix it because he has the Ocarina of Time. And this allows him to rewind the 3 days over and over again as long as he needs in order to find the proper solution in order to stop the moon from killing everybody. And what ends up happening is Link saves the day, and he doesn't ever find his friend, but he learns some important lessons along the way. And he eventually returns to the land of Hyrule, and it's unknown what happens to him then, because that's where the game ends. But this is where we get to our next game in the series, Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess occurs 100 years after the events of Majora's Mask. Hyrule is flourishing, and it seems like nothing bad can go wrong. And unfortunately, everything that can go wrong does go wrong when enemies from another parallel universe come to attack everybody and make things bad. So what happens is Ganondorf in this timeline has been captured by Hyrule, and he was sentenced to death 100 years ago. Unfortunately, he doesn't die. He's just sent to a parallel world where he finds enough energy and steals some mines in order to help him along his path. And what he ends up doing is he takes control of this guy, Zant. He lives in this parallel realm known as the Twilight Realm. And he uses Zant as a way to take over the kingdom by turning the kingdom's princess into an imp. And her name is Midna. She's the princess of Twilight. After Midna is turned into an imp, she has to flee her home and go into Hyrule, where Hyrule is then invaded by the Twilight and its army of shadow monsters. And basically, Link has to team up with Midna in order to defeat Zant and eventually defeat Ganondorf, who is Zant's master. What happens is Zelda and Link work together with Midna in order to defeat Ganondorf, and they save the kingdom of Hyrule. And that's how the game ends, which leads us to our next game in the timeline, which is known as Four Swords Adventures. Now, this game is kind of just stuck on the end of the timeline because probably the developers just didn't know where else to put it. Basically, what happens is Link finds the Four Sword again and frees it from its pedestal, and he defeats Vati, who was imprisoned in the pedestal at the end of the game. And that's how the child timeline ends. Now we're going to explain the downfall timeline, which is the last timeline in this very complicated 3-timeline split. What happens is the downfall timeline is basically an alternate universe where in the final battle with Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, Link dies and he's defeated, which leads to the events of the next game in the timeline, A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past follows Link as he is forced into a battle once again with Ganondorf, as Ganondorf has claimed control of the Triforce and used it to plunder the realm. Link is able to eventually defeat him, which leads to the next game in the timeline, which is known as Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Now, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons follow Link as he travels to these two kingdoms known as Holodrim and Labrynna, and helps out these two oracles to defeat evil again. And he wins and he saves the day, which brings us to our next games in the timeline. Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening follows Link after the events of Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, where he is marooned on an island known as Koholint Island after he was shipwrecked in a storm. Now, Link has to travel the island in order to wake the Windfish, which is a magical fish that can only be woken up by 7 magical instruments playing the same song at the same time. So he has to go and awaken the Windfish in order to leave the island. Unfortunately, waking the Windfish also destroys the island because the island actually isn't real and it's all a dream, and waking the Windfish erases the dream and allows Link to return to the normal world. At the end of the game, Link wakes up from his sleep and his slumber, and he finds that the island is gone and it was, in fact, all a dream. And after the events of Link's awakening, Link essentially lives out the rest of his life normally. I hope he has a happy life, because he is actually the same Link from A Link to the Past. So he's just lived through 4 video games, which is the most Links out of anyone in this timeline. But what happens next is the next game in the timeline, which is known as A Link Between Worlds. In A Link Between Worlds, Link finds himself in his kingdom being attacked by monsters from a parallel dimension, which is known as Lorule. Lorule is basically trying to steal Hyrule's Triforce because they lost their own Triforce. Now, Link is able to, with the help of Zelda, defeat the Princess of Lorule, who ends up being the villain. And what happens is, after being sent back to Hyrule, they use their own Triforce, and they make the wish to restore Lorule's Triforce, which brings peace to both kingdoms. And after doing this, the Link from A Link Between Worlds departs from Hyrule, and he ends up going to another kingdom known as Hytopia. In the next game, which is known as Triforce Heroes. Triforce Heroes is a spin-off game that we don't really like to talk about, but basically all that happens is a witch steals... she doesn't steal. A witch curses the princess of Hytopia, and Link has to go and defeat the witch. After defeating this witch, that's where we say goodbye to the hero of A Link Between Worlds, and we finally get to the first game that was released, the original Legend of Zelda, in the next game in the timeline, Legend of Zelda. In the original Legend of Zelda, Link has to go on a quest to save the Princess of Hyrule, Zelda, because Zelda is being held captive by an evil monster named Ganondorf. And Ganondorf is holding Zelda captive because she has the Triforce of Wisdom. And what Zelda does is Zelda splits the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces, and Link has to look for all 8 shards across the land, and then go defeat Ganon. It's the first game in the Zelda series, and it's probably the simplest in terms of story. But then we get to our next game in the series, The Legend of Zelda 2, which is about Link on a quest to find the Triforce of Courage, so he can wake up another Princess Zelda who is sleeping in Hyrule Castle because she was cursed to fall into a deep sleep. At the end of the game, Link manages to wake up this princess, and he saves the day again. Now, that is the last game in the Downfall timeline, but there is one game left in the series, and that game is Breath of the Wild. In this game, Link has just awoken from a 100-year-long slumber, during which his kingdom has been absolutely decimated by an evil force known as Calamity Ganon and his army of monsters. Link has to head to Hyrule Castle in order to destroy Ganon and save Princess Zelda, who has been locked away within the castle for 100 years, trying to keep Ganon at bay. Link is eventually able to defeat Ganon and save the princess. And that, my folks, is the end of the Zelda timeline. It has been a wild ride, and it has been very complicated, but I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So, thank you. Goodbye.